So let me go ahead and give you just a brief introduction of what the panel is going to be discussing today, and then I'll go ahead and introduce our distinguished panelists. My goal today is to get some really good conversation going, maybe even to compete with that beautiful beach we have outside in Maui. So hopefully we can make this very enjoyable this morning for you as well. So the use of commercial, civil, and military purposes of space continues to grow. We're all well aware of that, as does the pace of advancements in technology. And some may say that this advancing technology poses challenges for policy, but I like to think of it more as an opportunity. I might be biased given my job right now. Ideally, we can leverage policy to provide prioritization as well as a very cost-effective framework for technology development and implementation, tackling that big data problem, if you will. So the tenets in the U.S. national space policy actually set up that framework. It not only enables but also encourages international cooperation and the use of commercial capabilities. This panel, we're going to discuss what that national space policy includes specifically and how different government organizations are implementing it. The bottom line is there's an increasing recognition that the value of commercial and international capabilities bring to SSA is tremendous. So with that, let me introduce our distinguished panel today. I'll just go down the line. I noticed that the program says today we're looking at DoD, SSA, but actually our first panelist is from the Department of State. So Dr. Dana Johnson is the Deputy Director for Space Policy in the Office of Missile Defense and Space Policy at the U.S. Department of State. She's responsible for providing analysis and expert advice on national security space policy in support of U.S. foreign policy and national security. In addition to her other responsibilities, Dr. Johnson leads State's official coordination and review of STRATCOM-led SSA information sharing agreements and serves as the U.S. lead negotiator of the 2003 SSA agreement with Japan. Dr. Johnson's extensive professional experience includes senior analyst for space and missile defense in the Northrop Grumman Analysis Center, political science at the RAND Corporation, member of the technical staff at Rockwell International, and diplomatic historian in the Department of State. Dr. Johnson is the author of numerous books, monographs, and studies, and is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and Missouri State University in the Fairfax, Virginia campus, teaching classes on space security. My goodness, you're quite busy, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Joseph Kohler is currently on assignment as Space Policy Advisor at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. In this position, he serves as a thought leader and senior staff analyst responsible for providing technical advice and analyzing space-related United States government and DoD policy matters. He directly supports key international strategy efforts in order to fully implement the President's national space policy and the Secretary's national security space. Prior to his assignment, Dr. Kohler co-managed the Space Science and Applications Development Group at Los Alamos National Laboratory and is actually the founder of the Los Alamos Space Weather Summer School. He's developed novel data assimilation and machine learning techniques and holds a U.S. patent in space weather modeling in decisional timeframes. Dr. Kohler received his PhD in astrophysics from Rice University in 2004. Next, we have Dr. Mariba Jha. He's the mission lead for Space Situational Awareness at the U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory's Space Vehicle Directorate. Dr. Jha is also the lead for an AFRL astronautics research consortium called ASTRIA, which assembles expertise from government, academia, and private industry. He leads several international SSA collaborative efforts. Dr. Jha is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and an associate fellow of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He serves on several national and international technical committees and has subject matter expertise in astrodynamic sciences and technologies, understanding and predicting the behavior of space objects. And last but not least is Brian Wheaton, who is currently the technical advisor for the Secure World Foundation with 15 years of professional experience in the national and international space security arena. His wealth of technical knowledge and expertise has established him as a thought leader for providing critical analysis that supports development of space policy. Prior to joining SWF, Mr. Wheaton served 9 years on active duty as an officer in the United States Air Force, working in space and intercontinental ballistic missile operations. In his current role as technical advisor, Mr. Wheaton conducts research on space debris, global space situational awareness, space traffic management, protection of space assets, and space governance. Mr. Wheaton holds a Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering, a Master of Science degree in space studies, and is currently a doctoral candidate in the public policy and public administration at George Washington University. So take a moment just to recognize our panel members today. I'm going to go down the line, and just each of the panel members is going to give a 10 or 15-minute discussion on the topic that I described earlier, and then we'll go ahead and start taking your questions. Please, again, don't hesitate to submit those questions while they're talking, as I will be sort of looking at them here as we go along. Dana, please.
Morning. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Millard, for your kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd really like to express my thanks to the Maui Economic Development Board for inviting me here to participate in what will certainly be an interesting discussion. And more importantly, too, getting me out of the bubble of Washington and to beautiful Maui. So I'd like to begin with a quote from former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. In October of 2011, she gave a speech on American global leadership where she said, "In such a complex world, it's no longer enough to be strong. You also have to be smart and persuasive. The test of our leadership going forward will be our ability to mobilize disparate people and nations to work together to solve common problems and advance shared values and aspirations," unquote. While her remarks were focused on U.S. foreign policy in general, they continue to remarkably apply well to U.S. space policy today. The world is inspired by space exploration and is increasingly interconnected through and dependent on space systems. Our prosperity and security rely on communication, navigation, financial activities, and many, many other activities that depend on information from space systems. The space environment, with its challenges of natural and man-made threats, and with over 60 nations operating or benefiting from space systems, is as complex as the world Secretary Clinton described. This complexity means that all nations must work together to advance approaches for responsible behavior in space, and the United States, with our history of leadership and current capabilities in space, should lead the pursuit of potential solutions to these shared challenges. Space situational awareness, or SSA, is a foundational capability for spaceflight safety and preventing collisions in space. International cooperation on SSA is greatly beneficial as international partnerships bring the resources, capabilities, and geographical advantages to enhance SSA upon which we increasingly depend. The U.S. national space policy recognizes this fact and thus directs us to collaborate with foreign governments, the private sector, and other organizations to improve our SSA, specifically to improve capabilities to rapidly detect, warn of, characterize, and attribute natural and man-made disturbances to space systems. Having accurate and timely information is critical for many reasons, not only for the protection of human spaceflight, but also for U.S. and allied security and for the protection of our shared civil, commercial, and scientific investment in space systems upon which our economies and societies depend. In implementing the President's national space policy, the United States is pursuing bilateral and multilateral transparency and confidence building measures, or TCBMs, to encourage responsible actions in and the peaceful use of space. TCBMs can be top-down, near-term, pragmatic, voluntary actions that nations do to prevent mishaps, miscalculations, and mistrust. TCBMs, such as the European Union's proposed International Code of Conduct for Outer Space Activities, can contribute to everyone's awareness of the space environment. This also includes the political commitment to notify other spacefaring nations of orbital collisions or breakups that could pose a hazard, and to provide timely notification of space object malfunctions that could result in increased probabilities of high-risk reentries or space object collisions. These political commitments are complemented by work on bottom-up guidelines on space operations and collaborative space situational awareness in multilateral fora, such as the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS. Bilaterally and multilaterally, SSA sharing efforts leverage existing national SSA capabilities, technical exchanges among experts and space operators, assessments of how information can be shared in an internationally acceptable format, and development of best practice guidelines that can be implemented by government and private sector stakeholders. The Department of State works very closely with the Department of Defense on SSA information sharing agreements with foreign partners. To date, the United States has signed SSA sharing agreements and arrangements with its 6 national governments, 1 international intergovernmental organization, and 42 commercial entities. The strategy is to move to enhanced SSA cooperation where two-way information exchanges are established and more rapid notification of space hazards occurs. However, this requires having accurate contact information for satellite owners and operators, and agreement on data formats and other technical characteristics. The Department of State continues to work with U.S. Strategic Command to identify contact information for both government and private sector satellite operations centers. We hope that as our space surveillance capabilities improve, we will be able to notify satellite operators earlier and with greater accuracy in order to prevent collisions in space. To this end, the United States is working with other spacefaring nations to develop guidelines and procedures for enhanced spaceflight safety. As I noted before, the United States participates in multilateral fora such as COPUOS, which serves as the primary forum for diplomatic discussions on space sustainability. Decisions in COPUOS and its subcommittees are reached by consensus. In other words, each nation has an equal voice, thus putting a premium on cooperation and collaboration to achieve common goals. Within the COPUOS Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, the Working Group on the Long-Term Sustainability of Outer Space Activities has addressed a range of developmental, operational, and regulatory topics, including space debris, space weather, and measures to support collaborative SSA. For the past 3 years, over 70 technical experts from 23 UN member states have met in 4 expert groups to develop a set of best practice guidelines on these topics. SSA-related guidelines call for promoting techniques and investigation of new methods to improve the accuracy of orbital data for spaceflight safety, performing conjunction assessment during orbital phases of controlled flight, and promoting the use of common internationally recognized standards when sharing orbital information on space objects. If you're interested in more detail, I'd recommend reviewing the reports issued by the 4 expert groups as well as the LTS working group chair, Dr. Peter Martinez of South Africa. You can find those on the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs website. The United States delegation to COPUOS has included experts from NASA, NOAA, DoD, as well as industry, universities, and non-governmental organizations. Having industry and non-governmental stakeholder organizations participate in these expert groups is essential, not only for their expertise and technical advice to the government, but also to encourage acceptance and buy-in from the space operator and space industry communities responsible for implementing these guidelines on a daily basis. So in conclusion, I'd like to return to former Secretary Clinton's observation that in the complex world we inhabit, it's no longer sufficient to be strong. We have to be smart and persuasive. Being smart means making sure our government can leverage private industry's innovation and exciting new opportunities in SSA technologies, techniques, and procedures into our policy deliberations and diplomatic engagements. In certain instances, private sector innovation is frequently way ahead of government's ability to debate and develop a policy to support broader implementation of that innovation. Being persuasive means ensuring that we reach out to actively include newer spacefaring nations to encourage their technical engagement and to build capacity. Capacity building means making sure those nations have the requisite domestic regulatory mechanisms in place to ensure that governmental, commercial, and academic space activities can adhere to best practice guidelines for long-term sustainability. We also need to continue to ensure our domestic legal capacities keep up with emerging private sector opportunities in space and serve as a model for other countries. Finally, as Secretary Clinton noted, being able to, and I quote, mobilize disparate people and nations to work together to solve common problems and advance shared values and aspirations, unquote, is a test of our space leadership in an increasing complex world. As the U.S. National Space Policy notes, and I quote, it is the shared interest of all nations to act responsibly in space to help prevent mishaps, misperceptions, and mistrust. The United States considers the sustainability, stability, and free access to and use of space vital to its national interests. Expanding SSA cooperation and a whole-of-government approach with our allies, space partners, and other established and emerging spacefaring nations as well as with private sector partners, can lead to beneficial long-term results for everyone in a world needing more positive examples of international cooperation. So I'd like to commend the Maui Economic Development Board and its conference partners for bringing together this SSA Policy Forum. This space situational awareness discussion is so important for all responsible stakeholders in space. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Dr. Dr. Kohler.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lindsay, and I'm really honored by your invitation to participate on this panel. And I really want to congratulate also the Maui Economic Development Board for organizing the AMOS conference again and turning it into such a premier event on space situational awareness. Thank you. I want to talk about today on SSA sharing, the current state of affairs, what the United States is doing, in particular what the Department of Defense is doing on SSA sharing, and I want to give you a couple of updates. But in order to do that, I want to reach back a little bit and give you a history on SSA sharing. The space age began almost 6 decades ago with just 2 superpowers and a couple of satellites. Today, the space environment, it's estimated we have about 500,000 debris pieces, active satellites, rocket bodies, and so forth. But only about 20,000 of those are really cataloged. And, but all of them pose a significant threat to spacefaring nations and how we operate in space. And we have grown since the last 6 decades, we have grown very dependent on space and on the space assets. It really allows people and governments around the world to see with clarity, to communicate with certainty, and to navigate with accuracy. And all these are we are really getting very dependent upon. And space and spacecraft technologies contribute much to the transparency and stability among nations. And but everybody knows the current challenges in space, the 3 Cs: congested, contested, and competitive. I don't think I have to go into the details on what they mean. We've discussed those over the last couple of years very much in detail. But the United States is very much committed to addressing these challenges. And so, for example, Dr. Johnson from State Department pointed out a couple of the international multilateral efforts that are going on and how we are addressing these challenges, and they include United Nations COPIUS, and DoD is working very closely with State Department on these efforts. Another example is the group of government experts who have recently completed a report on transparency and confidence building measures. And another example is the European-led International Code of Conduct, which is implementing many of these confidence and transparency building measures. But today's topic is SSA sharing, and which is it's another example of transparency and confidence building measures, and it's very important to do that. In 2004, the United States Congress authorized DoD to share information that was derived from the Space Surveillance Network. This was a US Air Force program. A pilot project was started. It was called CFE, which stands for Commercial and Foreign Entities Sharing. And spacetrack.org, the website that many of you might be familiar with, was initiated. In 2009, US Strategic Command took over that responsibility. And in 2011, Strategic Command received additional authorization to share advanced safety of flight information through a formal agreement. So entities who have signed a formal agreement will receive advanced safety of flight information. Those include, for example, screening predicted orbits against catalog for conjunctions, launch support services to make sure somebody can launch into space without a collision, deorbit, re-entry, and end-of-life disposal activities, and anomaly resolution. So these are the advanced services that entities can receive if they have signed an SSA agreement with US STRATCOM. And so SSA sharing is really done on 3 different levels. One is on a public level. Pretty much everybody can sign up to the spacetrack.org website, where academic, R&D, amateur observers can receive access to the catalog. The next level is SSA sharing with agreement holders, the ones I spoke about earlier. So that is in particular for owner-operators, organizations who have a particular interest in operating and are currently operating in space and have signed an agreement with US STRATCOM. And they can be commercial, they can be intergovernmental, or government nations, other nations. They will receive access to higher quality data and advanced flight services. And today, almost 50 agreements, including government, intergovernment, and commercial entities, have signed an agreement with US STRATCOM. And so recent examples include France, EUMETSAT, the Republic of Korea, South Korea. And there are a couple of additional agreements in progress and at various stages of the negotiations, and but they're being pursued. But just the fact that since just in a few years, US STRATCOM was allowed to make these agreements with other entities, and almost 50 have signed, is actually tells me that it's a good way of SSA sharing, and it's a popular way for other entities, governments, and commercial entities to use the services that US STRATCOM is providing. I think it's a success story. And a third level on SSA sharing is with our allied and partner nations. So these are US national security partners. A couple of updates I wanted to give you. So for example, US STRATCOM recently completed an SSA sharing study, and some of these findings from the study are currently being implemented. For example, there is an enhancement being worked on at the moment to spacetrack.org, and the catalog is going to increase very soon from about 16,000 objects to 23,000 objects that people have access to in spacetrack.org. These are so-called analyst satellites, or debris objects that were not previously tracked very well, or were not we were not able to attribute to where those debris pieces came from. So they were actually excluded from the public spacetrack.org satellite. So the catalog is growing pretty soon here over the next couple of months. Another effort that came out from, and General Hayden alluded to it earlier, that SSA sharing should not be a one-way street. There's lots of data out there, and we want to be able and use that data. And so recently there was an contract awarded for a non-traditional data preprocessor, and which I think is a key step really in SSA sharing in multiple ways. So data cannot flow just one way, and JSPOC is actually able to include very accurate data from providers. It will be used for updating the catalog, and the benefit to the data provider is then in return to receive updates that are based on a higher accurate catalog. Another example is a recent tabletop exercise that was hosted at US STRATCOM. It brought together US and allied nations to discuss integration of various space capabilities for mission essential functions. And the lessons learned from this tabletop exercise will guide the development of new capabilities to improve SSA sharing and to enhance the resilience of US and international commercial space assets. So in closing, I want to summarize. The core really of addressing today's challenges, or one of the cores, is SSA sharing. It's SSA, Space Situational Awareness. It's the collection of it, it's the sharing of it, and it's the fusion of SSA data. The Department of Defense is committed to SSA sharing and is committed to continuously improving through internal studies and listening to the community, what the needs are. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions during the panel session. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. My name is Marie Baja, and represent the Air Force Research Laboratory. Thank you again to MEDB for being able to organize this and put on such a great conference. Hopefully everybody is still a little bit awake here in the room. So I just want to capitalize on a few things that kind of were mentioned. I think that, and I echo a lot of the words of my colleagues here that preceded me, that there are very good and successful things that have already happened and there are mechanisms in place to get kind of these sharing lanes in the road done. The thing that we want to do as a laboratory is we realize that great policy is definitely leverages the best scientific and technological input, and that is a key piece. And we want to make sure that there's rigorous, comprehensive science that is made available to policymakers so that the policy can be as informed as possible. So from the scientific and technological piece, there are things that are still unsolved, lots of challenges that remain. We still don't fully understand or comprehend the space domain and how many objects are up there and how integrated space environment actually interacts with those objects and affects services in ways that we can attribute cause to certain anomalies and be able to disambiguate whether or not some sort of loss or degradation of a service occurred because of a natural event or because of something that was intentional, for instance. And so there's a scientific exercise that needs to be had there. One of the things that's crippling that community is the lack of availability of data. And the thing is, we heard General Hyten, bless you, we heard General Hyten basically remark that really pushing forward for JMS, being able to not just have knowledge, but the ability to act upon that, to enable decision-making processes. And that's really what we want to push as a laboratory. One of the interesting things that happened recently because of this whole idea of openness and transparency is that the National Research Council put together a panel that did an exploration of Air Force Space Command's astrodynamic sciences and technologies that culminated in a document called Continuing Kepler's Quest that everybody can just Google and have access to. It's a free PDF. If you want to look at it, I suggest maybe doing so. And in any case, a result of Continuing Kepler's Quest is now General Hyten has pretty much mandated that this Astrodynamics Innovation Committee was formed, and we want to make data available not just to people within the United States, but also abroad. There's smart people all over the globe. The SSA problem is a global problem. It's not just a national, U.S. problem. And, unless, scientists and engineers have the availability of data to mature their algorithms and their understanding, unless we have that sort of exercise, then even if we're sharing state vectors and these things at higher levels, that doesn't necessarily get us to where we want to get to. So these mechanisms in place is important, but there's a scientific and technological exercise that needs to happen so that that can be as informed as possible. Interestingly, General Hyten also mentioned, capitalizing on commercial and international data sets as much as possible. Great thing that DARPA has stood up this Orbit Outlook program that is a pathfinder in being able to do that, and it's reaching out to commercial, academic, amateur, and even international folks. And Dr. Lindsay Millard is definitely a good point of contact for that. And again, the idea is, what data are available? How do we capitalize this to extract knowledge that enables action? Some people think, oh, well, data. Just we need as much data as possible. Data alone is not sufficient. If somebody says, oh, well, here's a state vector at this time for your object, and this is, probably of collision of blank. What does that mean? Are there any units attached to that state vector? What coordinate frame is that state vector represented in? What was the process by which those data were actually derived, as a product to inform somebody of a possible collision? These are very important questions that need to accompany the data so that it has some meaning. Correlation in and of itself isn't sufficient either. Case in point, I watched one of these news channels not too long ago, and one of the things that some reporter said was, it turns out that children who brush their teeth twice a day end up going to college and being very successful. Oh, that's wonderful. All I have to do is tell my kids to brush their teeth twice a day and it's solved. No. Correlation is not causality. We need to go beyond just seeing correlations and understand what's the cause of that, what's driving that correlation, and understand the space domain from a more holistic and comprehensive sense. And so these are the things that the laboratory is really trying to do, and get other folks in the community together, really focus on this collaboration. But the foundational piece, again, aside from making the data available, is bringing the best and brightest minds together, because there is a scientific and technological gap that as a world we need to start crossing and bridging, so that these mechanisms that are put in place to share these things are very, much more meaningful and can inform great policy in moving forward. And that's all I have.
Good morning. I'm going to focus on two areas, kind of hopefully to complement what's already been said by the other panelists here. One is also I would like to give a kind of a history of where we've been with SSA policy, and along the way, a bit of an insight into why it seems that occasionally there are 2 steps forward and 1 step back every once in a while. And then the second thing is a bit of my perspective as an outsider to the U.S. government policy process of where there may still need to be work to be done and additional steps to be taken, including some of the recent discussions that Congress has had, because this is not something that is just a policy issue for the executive branch, but there are also some aspects of it that Congress is going to have to deal with along with what their responsibilities are in the separation of powers. So history, looking back, the U.S. government started sharing data in SSA as far back as the late 1950s. There was actually a process by which NORAD gave data to NASA and then would provide that data to end users via a mail service. So you can imagine how that took a bit of time to get TLEs printed out and sent by mail to whoever needed them. In the 1990s, that was transferred to a website that was maintained by NASA Goddard, the Orbital Information Group. That was a bit more of an automated process, sort of a precursor to the Spacetrack website we have today. And as Dr. Kohler mentioned, around 2000, the DoD started looking at how they would transform that process, and eventually a decision was made to go towards this Commercial and Foreign Entities Initiative, which gave the DoD permission to do it itself and provide this data to its partners. That began as a 3-year pilot program, and the initial instantiation of the Spacetrack website that was eventually extended and became what we see today of this publicly available source of data. Along the way, there was this event in 2009, the first ever that we know of collision between 2 satellites, Iridium and Cosmos. And that was sort of a watershed moment. Students of public policy often look for situations where there is an outside event that causes some sort of a change, a disruption in a static policy environment, and that was certainly one of them. That caused the U.S. government to go back and look at what is it doing in terms of trying to prevent this from happening again in the future. One of the options was to provide more data to allow all satellite operators to do their own analysis to prevent collisions. Another option was to do that analysis for other satellite operators. And the decision was made to do the latter. That then, combined with this transition from CFE being run by Air Force Space Command to U.S. STRATCOM as the lead agency, is really kind of behind a lot of the policy efforts you're seeing today. There have been a number of policy agreements that have been negotiated recently that have mentioned by some previous panelists. I would just like to point out a couple of them. There's really three categories, as was mentioned. There's bilateral with satellite operators, there's bilateral with countries, and then there's one very interesting, what I'll call multilateral agreement. Bilateral several countries, the ones that have been done, France, Italy, Japan, Canada, Australia, and just recently South Korea. That's a very interesting list, including some non-traditional partners for the U.S. in space and space security activities. And in work, they have agreements with UK, Germany, Israel, and Brazil. All this was mentioned by Admiral Haney in testimony before Congress earlier this year. At the multilateral level, there was an announcement along with the Space Symposium earlier this spring of an agreement between the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia on what began as a discussion of combined space operations and is really sort of a closer arrangement between those four countries of not only sharing data, but also some sort of coordinated operations. That originated with a discussion at one of the previous Shreveport War Games about, in the future, the fight is not just going to be the U.S. by itself. There's going to have to be a way to incorporate U.S. allies and commercial partners in the decision-making process and in responding to the sorts of potential situations that General Hyten said, we need to try and prepare for so we can avoid them. And I think that's a very significant agreement in that it's new. It shows that we're going beyond just this data sharing, everything coming to the U.S. and thinking about how better to integrate allies. So along the way of this, there have been what I'll call ups and downs, or 2 steps forward and perhaps 1 step back in the process. Up until about 1983, the U.S. was publishing data on virtually all the objects in space, absent very select few U.S. national security satellites. In 1983, there was a change. There were many more satellites that were excluded from the publicly available data. Between 1999 and 2003, this actually included GPS satellites, which at the time were broadcasting their position to everybody with a GPS receiver, but they were removed from the Space Track website. Today, there is still a policy for national security satellites where their data is not publicly available, and that can even apply to satellites that were launched alongside U.S. national security satellites, whether that be university CubeSats or even in some cases NASA satellites. And those organizations can have trouble then getting access to that data for those launches. There have been some really significant improvements that have sort of been quietly rolled out. There was a switch over to this enhanced GP program recently with the way that the JSPOC is creating the TLEs that it's putting out. Ostensibly, that is an improvement to the quality, but it caused a bit of disruptions in some of the academic circles of people that were using historical analysis of the data, and suddenly the methodology of how that data is created changes. It's not necessarily a bad thing to make the change is a good thing, but there's a bit of a communication question there. The recent announcement to add the analyst satellites to Space Track, I think, is a very positive development, because these are now several thousand objects that are now going to have more data available. But at the same time, there was an announcement that they're going to stop publishing RCS data on objects, and it's going to go from actually publishing RCS values to categorizing them as large, small, or really, really small. That is seen by many of the outsiders as a step backwards, because they were using some of that data for some scientific purposes and some of the research purposes. So along the way, this is not unique to SSA. Space happens to be one of these dual-use activities where there's a constant balance between national security risk and societal benefit. And we've seen this with GPS, we've seen it commercial remote sensing, with a number of other domains, where as the policy process goes on, there's this constant tug of war between these two sides. And the United States government, believe it or not, is not a unitary entity. Not everybody in the government thinks along the same lines. Not every organization has the same perspectives, or what economists would call preferences. And so as these discussions are going on, you have different organizations coming into play. You have, as was mentioned earlier and hinted at, fiefdoms and turf battles, and different opinions on what the priority should be at a particular time. So to those, as I was at one time, you know, as an engineer and then an Air Force operator, kind of outside of this process, kind of wondering what the heck is taking so long, or why is it that we can't just make a decision and go? Well, it's a very, very complicated thing. And you have to take kind of a more step back and take a more overview of it and see what the trend is over time, and not necessarily focus on individual little decisions. So I'll finish up just by mentioning a few things of where I think the U.S. still needs to go, and then I'll bring in that congressional piece. As General Hyten mentioned this morning, bringing the allied partners into this equation is extremely important for the U.S. And a big question that there's still a lot of work to be done on is, how is the U.S. going to make use of what its allies are bringing to the fight? There's a growing number of friendly countries who see SSA as a priority. They're looking to develop their own capabilities and contribute them to the group effort. And as General Hyten pointed out, to the 2010 National Space Policy and 2011 Security Space Strategy, both mention this is a big priority. Some of the recent bilateral agreements are signed, there's progress. But there are still some questions. How is the U.S. going to integrate these allied capabilities into its architectures? What's the trade between having the U.S. government spend money on building capability and perhaps working with its allies on them building capability that's then brought to the fight?
Mr. Whedon, I have to ask you to, finish up quickly. We have about 15 questions in 20 minutes.
Almost done.
Thank you.
There's then this question that was raised by Congress. There was a hearing earlier this year, and the question was, how does the U.S. government as a whole deal with space debris? Part of that question was federal agency roles and responsibilities for not only oversight of the private sector, but also providing information on this issue of space traffic management. And this was kind of the first time that Congress has really gotten serious about this question, and there was a lot of good discussion, and it's the beginning of a discussion about what should the federal agency responsibilities be across the DoD, but other organizations. And then what does Congress need to do to provide authorities, potentially budget, and on the executive branch side, interagency coordination. That discussion began earlier this year, and it's going to be going on for the next few years, and is probably where this policy discussion is going.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone on the panel. All right, like I said, I think we have maybe 25 minutes and about 15 questions. Don't stop sending them in. I'll keep looking at them. The first one that I think is actually really, really interesting and pertinent is, as many of us know, and it takes a world to do SSA. And a lot of the discussion, at least on the panel, has focused on what one might traditionally think of as a traditional U.S. ally. So the question is, how are we reaching out across the U.S. government to make sure that all stakeholders in space, which is almost everyone now, starts to get involved in SSA cooperation? And is that someplace that we're going? And so I guess I would let anybody who wants to go first take that question. Mariba, sure.
Yeah, so, one of the things that, I think that we're definitely doing in the lab is making sure that, the work that we're doing, we're communicating that to other countries through appropriate symposia, conferences, and that sort of thing. And there's an educational process, right? Because not everybody, even people who have space dependencies, really understand everything about SSA. I think part of it is bringing them into the discussion, showing kind of results, getting some common understanding of what those problems are, what the policy, technological hurdles are to overcome. And as these countries start getting more educated, then they start realizing, wow, I had no idea I had a capability or possibility to actually contribute towards this, global SSA narrative. And I think that's one of the things that we're definitely, pushing for.
Okay. Dr. Johnson, did you want to follow up?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And as I talked about in my remarks, from the State Department perspective, we engaged both bilaterally and multilaterally. We try to reach out, as the National Space Policy directs us to not only our allies and other space partners, but also to emerging and other established spacefaring nations, countries like India, South Korea, which is an ally, obviously, Japan. So we're trying to reach out both through bilateral relationships and then through other mechanisms like the multilateral fora that I and Dr. Kohler talked about, the COPUS activities, which is a bottom-up approach from a technical standpoint, to engaging and dealing with a whole host of issues, including SSA. Dr. Kohler also mentioned the group of governmental experts on space TCBMs. Well, part of SSA is treated in that report that came out last year. The Code of Conduct, which is a voluntary, politically binding approach that's being discussed. The European Union is the one that led with that activity. That's a worldwide effort to try to establish rules for responsible behavior in space. And a lot of it depends on having an understanding of what is going on in space, and that comes from multiple sensors, not just the United States, not just the European Union and Japan and other countries, but trying to reach out and encourage other countries to participate in this and to lead to responsible behavior in space. Thank you.
I think there's really a top-level approach and a bottom-up approach. And the top level is what Dr. Johnson talked about, work at international fora, United Nations and so forth, talking to other countries. And then there's a bottom-up approach, and I think a prime example really is the Amos Conference. This is where international colleagues get together, see what everybody else is doing, and learn from each other. And I think that's just a wonderful opportunity. And in between, you have SSA sharing agreements that can really flow them together from bottom up and top down, and really bring new countries into the mix and share data with them.
Okay, thank you. The next question, there's actually a group of questions here that relates to eliminating stovepipes within the United States, DoD. The specific question that I'm asking is how can we remove the exclusion list from being an impediment to U.S. entities sharing SSA data? But I'll go beyond that and say, with all the policy behind us to move ahead, General Hyten mentioned it today, policy isn't the issue. How do we actually begin to share data not only amongst ourselves within the United States, but really begin to share some high-level data with our international partners? And is that a way we should go? Yeah, we're all looking at you. We're all looking at you.
Well, I think it's obvious to me and many other people that is a way we have to go. It gets back to the previous question of this is bigger than just the U.S. As much as the U.S. worries about its SSA capabilities and ability to see things, many of the countries have the same question, and yet they have hardly anywhere near the capabilities the U.S. has. And so there is a need to provide a level of SSA information to everybody flying a satellite and to the growing number of countries that rely on space for national security. And how to provide that is a big question. And there are absolutely concerns about how does the U.S. protect some of its advantages and some of its national security capabilities. But that, again, that is balanced against, there may be value in increasing awareness to other countries of what's going on, because then that brings a greater awareness of what the challenges are in space and why there's the need to behave responsibly, why there's a need to avoid accidents and doing, I'll call them stupid things in space. So getting around there, 2 years ago, I suggested that perhaps, we move away from trying to protect locations of objects and move to protecting what their capabilities are. That's sort of a radical thing to say, and it's certainly not accepted that that is the solution, but that is one way to go about doing it.
So one thing that I was going to say, just to kind of, add on to what Brian said, is that, by and large, some people don't even realize what the implications of giving data to other people are yet in terms of that protection. It's very easy to take a conservative approach and say, if I share nothing, I'm safe, right? Well, that's not obviously the right answer. What can I share and still be safe? There's still actually an S&T exercise to try to find what that is. Two, not everybody believes that they know that they have the authority to actually share data. That's another thing that I've run into. It's like, okay, well, for routine things, some people might say, yeah, I can say yes to that and I can give you that. But for things that are maybe a little bit outside of the norm, well, who's going to make that decision? Well, if I say yes, what if something bad happens? Then I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to, so there's that sort of thing that needs to happen as well, is really trying to find out who owns data and who has the authority to do the release. And I think the last piece is people also feel a little bit territorial about the data and say, well, I have an advantage because I have the data and I can analyze it, and he who owns the data wins, and I own this stuff, and so I'm not going to let it go. So I think first thing is understanding exactly what can be released and still maintain that protection. Two, find out who owns data and who has authority to release it. And once that happens, then you elevate that into the public spotlight, and people who know that they can share and still don't then can suffer public humiliation, and we can kind of treat them that way.
I think that's a very good question on stovepiping. How do we get rid of stovepiping? And Dr. Jais was, over the last years, since I met him, always a very strong proponent of getting rid of the stovepipes. And I think there are two levels of sharing data. One is, do you want to just share the products of the data that the derived products? Or do you actually share the raw data? And I think the question was alluding more to the raw data, right? Because we are sharing the products. And so I think, yes, it would be great to have perhaps in the future a set of raw data that can be shared in the community. But then it has, the devil is really in the details, because when you share raw data, you also need to add uncertainties and the confidence levels of your data in it, because we all can just add data together, but if you don't understand how well the data was actually taken and what the real confidence levels are in the data, it opens up really a Pandora's box. But that's really the detail. The devil is in the detail there, and it's very, very difficult working in this field to understand what the uncertainty levels are, because when you start fusing data together, and that's a key target, to fuse data together from different observatories, different ways of measuring. In order to do that, you need to understand the uncertainties. But I think we're pushing forward to remove the stovepiping. We understand that it's limiting us, and I think the way forward really is to start with a small step of perhaps releasing a data set that people can agree to, and we can get started from there.
Okay. The next question I'm actually going to direct to Dr. Johnson, since she was silent, so this is not meant as punishment. But what is the policy relative to SSA to support debris removal and attribution of the debris to the originator? Or is there one, and how are you beginning to think about this?
I knew this was going to come up. The National Space Policy says that we are supposed to do research on active debris removal and on-orbit servicing. I don't have the exact language in front of me, but it is something that is in our National Space Policy. And here's where, just as an observation, I see a lot of commercial companies out there with some great ideas about how to do this. We've been talking all about the congestion problem, and there's a lot of interest in finding ways to innovate on that. The problem is that a lot of these issues are dual use issues. There's questions of liability. I'm not a lawyer, but I talked to the State Department lawyers, and they're all concerned about things like liability, like what's the legal aspect to this? Do we have permission to actually reach out to another spacecraft or a piece of debris? Who owns that piece of debris? So there's a lot of issues that we are still grappling with that, here's where I said earlier, where the pace of innovation is actually way ahead of the policy. This is something that we need to grapple with as a government. There's a lot of interest out there in the international community for this as well. So I don't know if we have an answer for it, but like General Hyten said, the policy is enabling. It tells us to go out and do it, and we should be looking at that. So thank you.
Other comments? Okay. So I've just got a flurry of questions in that switch the discussion a little bit over to commercial space. This one specifically says commercial actors increasingly have a role in ensuring that space is used responsibly. And in my own experience, industry is chomping at the bit to get involved in SSA. And so how can we, or should we, best leverage commercial innovation in SSA? And can we begin to get them involved in our discussions with our international partners? I'll start at the end with Mr. Whedon.
Well, I'll go back to some of the comments made by Dazzy Livero last year at this policy forum, where he outlined a vision of approaching the SSA problem the way that the DoD approaches the SATCOM problem, where the DoD and the SATCOM world acquires itself the exquisite capabilities, the hardened nuclear-protected SATCOM that it must have to do its mission. But then it reaches out to the commercial industry to provide a whole another level of satellite communication services that it contracts with. There's a similar approach that goes to remote sensing. And from my perspective, I think that's a very interesting model to look to SSA. What is it in developing SSA capabilities that the U.S. government and the DoD should be developing itself? What is it that it may then provide or buy as a service from the commercial sector? And then the question becomes, how does it go about fostering the development of those commercial capabilities? Is it through contract models, or is it through some sort of a prize system? I mean, NASA's had some experience in this recently with CCDEV work that they're doing for transportation to the space station. So I would put forward that is an interesting way to think about the problem and how it might better incorporate the commercial capabilities.
I think one thing from my perspective, and maybe not too many people in the room know about this, but there's something called the IGS, and basically it's people from all over the world contributing part of their own effort to provide an understanding of knowledge and models and that sort of thing that anybody can use freely. And so I think that part of it is the community needs to realize that it's in its best interest to make some knowledge that's globally known, and it's not about, well, I'm gonna put in all this effort, I'm gonna find this stuff out, and then I'm gonna charge an arm and a leg for it, because that's still kind of, data hoarding, and so, from my perspective. There's gotta be some level of collaboration where, again, people from different sectors realize that it's in our best interest to have some foundational knowledge of what's going on in space that can be used for other people to capitalize on, and yes, make profit, get rich, all these nice kind of things, buy a villa in Italy and that sort of stuff. But some foundational knowledge that is of everyone's benefit. One of the things that I like saying is we don't just teach an elite few people how to drive here in the United States. Everybody has to get that sort of knowledge, but we're not going to offer up a Lamborghini to everybody who gets a driver's license either. So you can have your Lamborghini, but the thing is, driver's ed should be something that is provided globally, and I think that's where the community needs to kind of go to.
I think there's a lot that can be gained from the commercial world, and I personally really applaud efforts like the Commercial Space Command and so forth. But going back, national space policy really directs us in supporting the commercial world, and so there are many efforts underway. Just as an example, for example, allowing imagery, satellite imagery providers to sell at lower resolution or, with increased resolution. As just an example, or, there are so many new efforts underway, just mentioning Skybox, Planet Labs, and so forth. I think there are many opportunities out there where the Department of Defense can work together with the commercial providers. There's a lot out there that's going on, and National Space Policy is directing us to do that and supporting the commercial world.
Okay, thank you. I think we have about 10 minutes left, so this is going to be the last question. And I've saved one for the end that I actually think is a very challenging question. It's one I might have trouble answering on a panel, so you're welcome. So let me couch it like this. Feel free to sort of give closing remarks and answer the question if you want to. So the question is, what types of policies, if any, should pertain specifically to the growing proliferation of micro and nano satellites and their possible impact on SSA? It's certainly a poignant question and one that I think is important to think about. So Dr. Johnson, closing remarks or comments on micro and nano satellites?
It's a very good question. I'm not entirely sure how to answer it. I think they offer some very interesting possibilities in terms of expanding our capabilities. But again, speaking from a State Department perspective, there's a number of issues that have to be addressed. It's not to say that we want to stifle it, we just want to better understand what these potential capabilities, technologies offer. I'm sure it's being discussed at the COPUOS meetings in Vienna. This organization meets several times a year, and it's addressed in technical discussions and things like that. I'm not as familiar with where they are in terms of understanding and how that fits into these larger international issues. Some of our international organizations take a long time to come up with policies and guidelines and things. Like I mentioned, the COPUOS best practices guidelines have been in work for at least 3 years. And so developing international consensus on what to do about these things, you have to take into account international perspectives. It's not just the United States. The United States has to work with its allies and other like-minded partners to be able to come up with consensus agreements on various guidelines, all the way up to specific language in international agreements. So this is a lengthy process that takes time, and sometimes innovation in nanosats and other things kind of leaps ahead of where the policy and the international development is. But as I mentioned earlier, the delegations also leverage the opportunities of having commercial providers, non-governmental partners, other people on these delegations that give us an additional perspective that we really need in order to be able to engage in the international community. So I continue to say, and others, my colleagues would also say, we appreciate the opportunities that the international private sector partners, international partners as well, that you give us a certain level of expertise that we in the government may or may not have, and you benefit us in participating in these kinds of delegations and these discussions. So, thank you.
I think that's a very good point that's coming up here, because we see there's a wave really coming, a wave of innovation and a wave of nanosats and small sats. And I like the analogy that Dr. Jha brought up earlier of a driver's license. It is, space is not just one nation, it's everybody, it's worldwide. And it's important to operate safely in space, to make sure that operators in space of nanosats and CubeSats and so forth are not causing harm to others, but doing that with a licensing process that is not stifling innovation. Right? We don't want to stifle innovation. It's very important to encourage, I see efforts at universities, I can name a couple of those, but just fantastic efforts in educating students using CubeSat programs. And I think there's a lot of innovation coming, but we need to make sure, on one hand, to operate safely, but not stifle the innovation. Thank you.
I'm going to play it safe and not even make any sort of comment on policy, because that's just not my thing. So thank you for having me on the panel.
Thank you. Mr. Reed.
Well, I think the comment about how do we enable this innovation to happen in a positive manner while avoiding some potential negative consequences is dead on. And that was actually one of the themes of that House subcommittee hearing earlier this spring, was how does the U.S. government implement debris mitigation guidelines, space traffic management, oversight of the private sector in a way that enables and fosters this kind of innovation, but helps mitigate against some of the potential negative consequences. I think part of the challenge is that there are two things kind of acting together. There's not only this wave of the shift towards small satellites that is driven largely by the technology. It's this technology and cell phones and iPads and things, and the commoditization of the hardware piece that is kind of fueling that. So that's coming. That's lowering barriers to entry. But what you're also seeing is a lot of this is being done by new actors. And that it's the universities, it's the startup companies, it's the countries that are getting into space for the first time, and the way they do that is with a small satellite. So not only are these small satellites hard to track, likely not maneuverable, and they're being dumped out by a dozen, 30 at a time, but they're also usually being operated by individuals or organizations that may not have a lot of experience in how to do this in a responsible manner. And so that's another part of the equation, is not only how do we put in place the oversight issues at the national level, but there's an education piece. And that is going to be a significant challenge that the entire community is going to have to get around and figure out in some way. I'll just close by putting a bit of a plug. We at Secure World are starting a project next year to put together a handbook for new actors in space that addresses this particular issue. And the goal is to provide kind of a document that is a high-level overview of what the international issues are, what the national issues are, and then the operations piece. And then to, at some point, have that to be able to offer to the community to help solve some of that initial process of getting people up to speed. It's going to be a big task, but we're going to be looking for help from others in the community for us to help us put together.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank our panelists for sort of bravely putting forth their opinions in this forum. Thank you.